On July the 1st, 1863, the two largest armies ever to assemble on American soil squared off, faced off, just outside the small town of Gettysburg, Virginia. And over the next 3 days, these two armies were going to fight the bloodiest battle in American history. Over 10,000 men killed, 30,000 plus wounded, all of them Americans, all of them, interestingly, almost brothers. In some cases, as you know, they literally were brothers. But even on a grand scale, these were men with a common background. All of them were immigrants from Europe. They all shared the same religion. They shared the same general heritage. They were all Americans. They were all proud to be Americans. They all saw themselves as doing what was right for America. They were, in a way, a very real way, family. But as you know, from dealings within your family, even within church families, family fights can be some of the most brutal, the most catastrophic, and the most difficult to get over fights in all the world. For 3 days, they fought back and forth, smaller skirmishes. The tide would turn in favor of the Confederates, then switch to the Union Army, and back and back and back again. And finally, on the third day, July 3rd, 1863, the Confederate artillery, with a small amount of powder and shells left, made the decision to take every bit of ammunition they had and to fire it directly into the Union fortress on Cemetery Hill. It was a natural outcropping of rocks. It was as secure as any medieval fortress. And with this show of force, though it used up all their ammo, they were determined to break a hole in that line and hopefully break the spirits of their brothers in blue. And they turned loose with everything they had. And the ammo went low and the gun stopped. And out of that gun smoke stepped 12,000 Confederate infantrymen who began running, jogging, walking, some limping across the 1 mile stretch, charging the Union forces hidden up in the rocks. That's when the Union forces returned fire with their cannons and unlimited ammunition. They decimated half the Confederates by the time they even got halfway across the field. Somehow, some of those Confederates broke through the middle lines and were pushing back. But then came more and more and more Union soldiers. They were endless. There were 90,000 of them or more. And a retreat was summoned. And those Confederates ran back across that mile-long stretch, stepping over the bleeding, screaming, dead bodies of their brothers. bloodiest battle in American history. Bloodiest, ugliest, and it turned out to be the big turning point of that war. From that scene, that battlefield, I want to take you to another field, much further back in time, actually 3,800 years back in time, to another field in a land far, far away in what is now Israel, a space of open land just over the banks of the Jabbok River. And there, two families faced off. Two families with problems so deep, so hurtful, so much bitterness, so much fear that this appeared to be the only way it could possibly end. Waiting in formation was Esau, son of Isaac, and 400 armed men, and advancing toward him across the field came his younger brother Jacob, bowing low. Jacob, overwhelmed with fear. There's an old saying that guilt makes men into cowards. Jacob was filled with fear. And even though the night before he'd wrestled an angel and came out strong, he still feared his brother. Esau had every reason to hate his brother, the brother who took the life he could have had 20 years ago. Esau's life had been harder. It had been tougher. It had been much more miserable than it would have had to have been if only his brother was not a crook. And so the scripture describes these two brothers as they marched toward each other. By the way, it was a family divided against itself. Each side, part of a same family, similar heritage, similar religion. They came from the same place, but they believed that the difference between them was too big. Genesis 33, beginning in verse 1. Then Jacob looked up and saw Esau coming with his 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and his two servant wives. He put the servant wives and their children at the front, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph last. Then Jacob went on ahead. Jacob had started it. It was only right that he would walk out alone to potentially finish it. And Jacob and Esau, two twin brothers who looked and acted nothing alike, advanced toward each other. And as they marched toward one another, neither of them had any earthly idea how drastically the other brother had changed. 20 years, even 10 years, makes a huge difference in the life of a person. Even people who don't want to change change in ways that they don't even realize they have. And that's why you've sometimes heard me say that if you are still angry, bitter toward a person who did something wrong to you 10 years ago or more, then that person who did you wrong no longer even exists. Their body still walks the earth. They're grayer, perhaps a little more stooped. Maybe from a distance they've not changed that much, but people change. We're constantly changing. And I'm telling you, the person who was such a threat 10, 20 years ago is rarely the person you think you're still dealing with. Remembering that, by the way, can help you reconcile. Esau, for example, his bitterness was gone. He was the oldest son. His brother, Jacob, younger brother, swindled him not once but twice. First, out of the blessing, then the birthright. It amounted to the whole inheritance of a wealthy father. And that left Esau with virtually nothing to start his life with. And yet, a remarkable thing had happened. During that time, God had blessed Esau in spite of the fact that he got off to a disadvantaged start. In spite of the fact that he lost the inheritance he was counting on for a living, when he lost it, when he had this setback, he found himself in a position where he was either going to have to work himself out of this hole or give up and die. And Esau obviously chose to keep living, to keep working, to keep growing, and it paid off. There's a hint of that in verse 9 of Genesis chapter 33. When the two men met, Jacob offered gifts of large herds and flocks of animals, the way wealth was measured. Offered that as a gift. And you know what Esau's response was? Keep your flocks, my brother Jacob. I have plenty. Let that sink in. You get this? He'd lost it all 20 years earlier. Looked like he was set up for poverty. And yet, because he somehow overcame his self-pity, his rage, his hate, and he turned his attention to the things he could still do something about, his fortune grew and grew and grew to the point that he needed nothing from anybody. Once he thought he did. Once he thought he couldn't make it without his father's inheritance. Now, even without it, he's got plenty. As for Jacob, oh my goodness, he too had completely changed. He had been forced to reap some of the scheming trickery that he sowed with his brother. He schemed and swindled his brother, Esau. But when he ran away to a far land and began to live with his uncle Laban, Laban turned out to be a pretty shrewd car dealer himself. And Uncle Laban tricked Jacob, the old trickster. Said, work 7 years for my daughter. And 7 years Jacob worked for that beautiful Rachel. And when wedding night came and he went to her tent and the veil pulled back, it was not Rachel. It was her ugly sister Leah. He complained, but it was no use. Laban said, hey, you know the way it works. The oldest has to be married first, work 7 more years, then I'll let you have Rachel. And so Jacob accepted that defeat. He didn't counter with another scheme. He didn't run from the reality. He worked another 7 years, honest 7 years, for Rachel. And the Bible says because of his attitude, because of his love for this Rachel, those 7 years to him seemed like but a few days. There's something about knowing you're doing what's right, especially when you've spent a lot of time doing wrong. There's something about knowing you're doing the right thing that is in itself empowering. And it gives you the determination to do things and grow through the process of doing them. Things that you'd have never done otherwise. Jacob grew. Well, neither brother that day had any idea what was about to happen. And there was only one way to find out. They began to walk toward each other. Genesis 33, verses 3 and 4. Then Jacob went on ahead. As he approached his brother, he bowed to the ground 7 times before him. Then Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they both wept. How's that for a surprising family reunion? Now, let me take you back to Gettysburg. But the year this time in Gettysburg is not 1863. It's 1913. It's the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, bloodiest on American soil. And the rebels and the Yanks, the Union soldiers and the Confederates who still lived and had a way to get to Gettysburg, assembled at Gettysburg for a reunion. And it was decided that they would do a reenactment of the worst part of that battle. The part I described in detail. It was Pickett's charge, where the Confederates charged the Union lines up in the rocks. Pickett's charge, the Union soldiers, those old Union soldiers, now walking with canes and walking sticks, somehow managed to get up into those rocks. Probably didn't go as high as they'd been 50 years earlier, but they got in the rocks. And the Confederates started at the edge of the woods and began limping, hobbling, not running, but scooting along fast as they could in a reenactment of Pickett's charge of Cemetery Ridge. And as they approached, a cry went up. And all of a sudden, the old Union veterans came streaming down out of the rocks. And those Confederate veterans limped and hobbled to meet them. And they met there in the middle of that field. And they embraced each other. And guess what? They wept. It's a sad thing when brothers turn against brothers and sisters against sisters, and firestorms start that nobody seems to know how to stop, and people get hurt on both sides, and separations, unnecessary separations occur. That's one of the saddest things that can happen in a family, even in a Christian family, maybe especially in a Christian family. But there can come a day when the old enemies finally come to their senses and realize, hey, things have changed. We're no longer back there. Whether it was last month or last decade or last century, the world has changed around us. I've changed and grown. You've changed and grown. And all of those forces, most of those forces and pressures that pushed us to fight and hate and hurt each other the way we did, many of those pressures are now gone. And with them goes the whole reason for fighting in the first place. You see, 50 years later, those brothers at Gettysburg, they were now old men. And unlike young men, old men, hopefully, by that point, no longer have anything to prove. They're not out to prove their manhood. They're out to make things right. You might say they've outgrown their ego and left it behind. Now they're free to be who they really are. The sons and daughters of God, made in His image and likeness. Family members and brothers after all. And as for the whatever it was that created the problems way back then, the things that motivated brothers to fight against brothers, those too were gone. Those Southern boys no longer fighting to protect their homeland from an invasion. No more of that. Those Union boys no longer on a mission to set slaves free, to hold the Union. All that stuff that made them fight was gone. And I want to ask you, what were the things that caused you and another person to split way back there someplace? What was it in you that you've since outgrown? What was it in them that's changed? What was it about your life situation that's completely different now? And therefore, there's no reason to keep this up. That's when brothers and sisters recognize they're still brothers after all. And so it was with Jacob and Esau. For the rest of their lives, they lived peacefully alongside each other, each with his own piece of land, each with his own extended family. And they put the old things behind them. And they moved on. And the most amazing scripture in this entire story is in chapter 33, verse 10. The last part of that verse, I'm going to show you. They had so changed. Their egos had fallen away. All the misconceptions and hate and fear that prevented them from seeing each other realistically back when were now gone. And I want you to look at what Jacob now said to Esau. Jacob says, "For I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me." Old enemy, I now see your face, and I don't see just a rough, scruffy orange beard anymore. I don't see angry eyes that make me want to run. When I look at you now, brother, I see the face of God. Folks, you can know reconciliation has happened. Forgiveness has occurred. That all things have become new when you get to the point where you can look into the face of a person you once hated or feared and no longer see that person. Instead, you see God in them. Are you seeing something that's brand new, that just arrived? No. They've been made in the image of God from the very beginning. God was in them all along. But you see, during that period when they seemed like such a threatening enemy, during that period of hate, resentment, and fear, you were not able to see them for what they are. You didn't see God in them. All you saw in them was fear and hate and 1,000 reasons why you can never make it right again. You know God has worked when those scales fall off. What can you do? What's your part in something like that? I want to give you some practical things you can actually do to cooperate with God in the process of reconciliation. I say cooperate with God because you and I do not have the power to create a complete reconciliation with anybody over anything, because it always involves at least one other person over whom we have zero control. And we have no control over how that person sees us, regardless of how we may see them. So this process through which the scales of hate and fear fall away and we see God in them, that is a process that God brings about, and our job is to cooperate with Him in it. That is, we don't resist it. As we feel our resentment beginning to fade, we rejoice rather than call for a nurse and emergency team and revive it. Nurse that grudge back to life. We let it shrivel and weaken so it eventually dies. We stop feeding it. What does it mean to stop feeding an old unforgiven grudge? The main way I see people feed it, the main way I've so often fed it through the years, was by incessantly talking about it, telling my sad victim story over and over and over to anybody who will listen, till it gets to where people start avoiding me because they're tired of hearing it. Every time you retell your sad story, it grows in its power over you. Be very careful of that. Am I saying stuff it and pretend it didn't happen? Heck no. Goodness, no. Be honest with yourself. Be honest with a group of trusted friends about just what happened and just how you feel. Get that out in a safe, healthy way. Tell that story one time. But listen to this. When you begin to notice yourself repeating things you've already talked about, you can know you've made this full circle. It's time to stop and cooperate with God. You know what it is. You can now cooperate in forgiving. And it will be a process. Listen, some things are a short process. Some things are longer. How long things take depends on so many factors. Maybe how big the hurt was. How long ago it was. How strong I am. How strong the other person is. How many other people are get mixed up in it. So many factors. It will be a process. But here's how you know you're making progress in the process. Sometimes the only sign of improvement you notice is that, you know what? My hate level, my hurt level, my fear is a little bit lower than it was yesterday. And if you have enough of those kind of days, it builds. Actually, it doesn't build, it deconstructs. And piece by piece, it's dismantled. Cooperate with that. Don't feed it. Another thing you can do, once you have apologized, once you've done all that's within your power to do regarding other people, go to work on yourself. Because in reality, in this world of ours, there is rarely one cowboy with a white hat and one with a black hat. We all wear various shades of gray. Because all of us have some bad, and all of us have some good, and all of us have some fears, and all of us have some hates. You can't do anything about anybody else's. Work on growing yourself. And here's what you do. Here's what happens. The pain level, let's say it's just for purpose of illustration, analogy. Let's say the pain level is waist high. As long as you don't keep feeding it and nursing it, it's probably not going to grow any higher. If anything, it'll start getting old and shriveling. Don't feed it, it stays the same. But if during that same time you are growing, because you're asking God, search me, O God, and try me, and show me if there be any unclean way, and you will always discover there is. Confess it, release it, move on, and as you do, you grow, and you grow, and you grow until you're so much bigger than that old hurt which once controlled you that you've outgrown it. You're the one in control now. You begin to see the truth that can set you free. The truth is that all of us are just brothers and sisters. We come from the same God. Most of us love, try to obey the same God. But in the process of trying to serve and obey that same God, we go at it in different ways that often clash. Recognize the truth that you don't have a true enemy in your brother, in your family member. What you have is an unfortunate mistake and misunderstanding and sin that needs to be left behind. And you move forward, and as you do, you actually begin to see the face of God in the person you once feared or despised. That's a truth that will set you free. As Jesus calls us to come home and work through whatever awaits us there. For God is there too. And God, of all the characters involved, is the one who most wants for love to win. And when love wins, everybody wins.